Good afternoon. On behalf of President Wayne Burton at North Shore Community College, I welcome you to our Lynn campus. We're situated here in our MBTA building, which houses some classrooms, and the main campus building is across the street, the Thomas McGee building. We also have two other campus facilities. One's in Beverly at the Cummings Center, where we house our Institute for Corporate Training and Technology, and in Danvers, where we have three buildings. Our newest building is actually a zero net energy projected building, actually the first in the Commonwealth and the second in the nation. On top of that, we service 16,000 students per year in both credit and non-credit programs, and we're here at the ready to help any workforce industry needs. And as the gaming industry moves forward, we hope that you'll look to us to help you. Have a good day, and Commissioner Zuniga.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Hi, my name is Enrique Zuniga. I'm one of the commissioners at the Mass Gaming Commission. I want to welcome to our fourth educational forum. The topic of today is compulsive gambling. So on behalf of my fellow commissioners, all sitting here at the front with me, we'd like to welcome here today. We are streaming live on our website, so we also welcome those watching at home or at their office. For the record, there is in our website, mass.gov/gaming, all of the minutes and videos of our previous meetings and also our previous educational forums. So let me mention a couple of points about problem gambling or compulsive gambling. There seems to be some debate in the medical community as to whether compulsive gambling constitutes an addiction or a behavioral problem. Many would agree, however, that regardless of that, the tools to address it are very similar and are known. It really comes down to identifying, preventing, and treating people with that, with that problem. Of course, we will hear about some of that today with the distinguished panel that we have here. This issue is a little bit personal to me because I grew up with my mom and my dad both being psychiatrists and psychoanalysts. So from a very early age, I came to just appreciate the relevance and importance of human behavior, studying and addressing issues around human behavior. Even though my father has spent a lifetime treating people, like most in the medical community, recognize and say and advocate a lot for the issue of prevention. And prevention comes with, or to address prevention, we really need to think about education and information, and which brings us to today. We'll be hearing a lot about that today, I suspect, but we also are thinking about this as an ongoing issue that we will be addressing and thinking about as we move forward. So the Gaming Commission has a lot to do in many aspects of the implementing the expanded gaming law, but addressing the potentially negative effects of the expanded gaming law is really at the top of its priorities. And one very important effect in that regard is the issue of problem gaming. So with that, I'd like to turn you over to Kathy Scanlon, who's going to introduce our panel. Let me just mention one more thing. Because this issue is such a priority to this commission, forming partnerships with the Mass Compulsive Gambling Council, others in the health and public health community are also a top priority for the Gaming Commission. So with that, thank you very much.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you again to North Shore Community College for hosting us today, and especially to Kathy Anderson for all her help in setting up all the many details that went into this. And thank you also to the Mass Gaming Commission, and welcome to the commissioners. It's been a long time since Massachusetts started discussing expanded gambling. My memory is 1995. And as a way of background into introducing the panelists that we have today and the program for today, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, the Mass Gaming Commission, we are extremely grateful to the Mass Gaming Commission for first of all, for holding this forum, as well as for the process that you're using in looking at the expanded gambling legislation. There are so many ways that could have been done, but to choose one where there is a thoughtful process of building information on the issue that you need to implement is extremely encouraging to us, and so we're really grateful for that process that you're selecting. When we looked at the legislation that the governor and the legislature produced and signed in last November, we were extremely pleased to see that there was not only an emphasis on maximizing benefits for the Commonwealth of expanded gambling, but also as much of an effort put into minimizing the harms. And we saw the legislation taking problem gambling extremely seriously when they looked at their provisions, and that they seek to reduce the harms by including several provisions that would address prevention, intervention, and treatment of gambling problems, as well as research into the issue, as well as responsible gambling policies and practices that would be required of the potential casinos. These measures that were required, I'm going to mention a couple of them so you understand where we're heading today with this forum. Some of the provisions in the legislation that are related to gambling problems are prohibiting underage gambling, and underage refers to 21. Prevention strategies would be required for vulnerable populations, limits on credit and check use, limits on marketing where it's requested by patrons, training of gaming industry employees, identifying patrons with problems and intervening, posting signage of helpline, and in as many languages as that would be deemed necessary, self-exclusion programs where a person could say they don't want to be admitted into the casinos, on-site counseling available all the hours that the casino is open, research that studies problem gambling as well as what are some effective interventions in reducing harms, public health trust fund established for programs that address gambling-related problems, as well as other public health strategies being required, and a gaming policy advisory committee with a subcommittee on addiction services. So looking at those provisions brings us to today's forum and why we're here today. Our aim in putting this forum together is to hope that it will be of help to the Commission in beginning to implement the provisions that relate to problem gambling. So today's forum we intend as pretty much an overview, and as Commissioner Zuniga said, this is probably the start of the conversation rather than the final word. It was challenging to find what we were going to do in this time period and what we were going to leave out. There's more to be said than is being covered today. So in presenting that overview, we intend to do two different sessions. One is on understanding the issue of problem gambling, and that's what our first session will cover. And then the second panel will talk more about identifying some of the challenges as well as some appropriate solutions that have worked for other folks. So we're going to begin our panel, unless there's anything anybody needs to add or ask. We're going to start our panel by introducing our panelists. And we have with us today Marlene Warner, who's Executive Director of the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling. Besides her presentation, I want to thank her also for her work in setting this up today, as well as the work of Amanda Hogenberg from the office who's here. They did a lot of background work to make this happen. And we also have speakers in recovery. Jody Neely and Scott Seeley are going to speak to us. And then Rachel Goldberg and Debbie LaPlante, who have been sort of pushed over to the side for a few minutes, but not really, will also come up when there's a little bit more room at the table, and will talk from their perspective. So our first session is going to really talk about the what is it and who's impacted. And we're coming from several different perspectives, many perspectives, academic perspectives, service delivery perspective, as well as personal life perspective on understanding what this issue is and maybe then some ways to respond to it later. So I'll set Marilyn.
Give me a moment to set up here. Well, again, thank you very much, Kathy. What Kathy failed to say was that she was the executive director of the Mass Council and program director and then executive director for 24 years, and so has recently retired, but still serving the council as a special advisor to the council. So I thank her for setting all of this up and still be willing to talk about this and have energy for this topic because it is an important one. And thank you to the commission. You know, I got a chance to meet each and every one of you through various events, and I can't stress enough, again, that the commission is very much dedicated to this issue, has been showing up at our, we had a Western Mass Symposium on June 1st, and two of the commissioners were there. We had a meeting last Tuesday with industry members, and one of the commissioners was there. And so there's definitely an ongoing interest in that since day one, since we first met with Chairman Crosby. So thank you very much for having us. My role is to kind of give you an overview, tell you a little bit about this topic, give you the right language, and then set all the rest of these folks up to give you some more specific details about this. So first, let me just introduce the Mass Council. The Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling's mission is to provide leadership in reducing the social, financial, and emotional costs of problem gambling, and to promote a continuum of prevention and intervention strategies, including information and education, capacity building, advocacy, and referral services for problem gamblers, their families, and the greater community. I would be remiss to not talk about the founder of the council. It was founded in 1983 by Tom Cummings, who experienced a problem with gambling in his own lifetime. He secured funding in 1987 for problem gambling services statewide, and then set us up in the office that we're actually still currently in at 190 High Street, and really advocated for a treatment system in 1998. Again, another important piece, and one thing that a lot of people ask us about, we are neutral on the issue of legalized gambling, neither for nor against, which is why we are here to talk about the issue of compulsive gambling. We provide services and advocate for those who might develop a gambling problem, and we advocate for responsible gambling-related public policy in the Commonwealth. Some council programs, I mentioned some of these, and I'm happy to give some more details, but certainly are out doing a lot of trainings, putting things out on the web, doing a lot of media campaigns, certainly working with individuals and working with larger entities such as schools, correctional facilities, things like that, to give them more capacity around this topic. We run a 24-hour helpline and do a lot of assistance via other telephone numbers for other languages, and certainly a wide array of prevention and recovery services. And advocate, and this is really a piece of the advocacy, is making sure that the voices of folks with gambling problems and their family members are heard. And here are our helplines and a little bit about that. We connect people to our some of our resources. You'll hear actually probably a little bit about your first step to change later through the NCRG and the DOA. 12-step help meetings, self-help meetings like Gamblers Anonymous. And there are 13 treatment centers across the state with clinicians, and then there's also private practice clinicians in Massachusetts. And there's our address and phone number. So what is problem gambling? This is something that a lot of people ask us. There's even just confusion about the title, problem gambling, or the name problem gambling. You'll hear it referred to in a number of ways. Pathological gambling, which is really the diagnostic, the DSM-4, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders title for it, pathological gambling. compulsive gambling, which is a bit more antiquated, but something that also talked about the severity. And certainly in 1983 was a popular title. Any councils being born now are not being called a council on compulsive gambling. They're really problem gambling. Gambling disorders, which really represents a wide array of problems, and also gambling addiction. And again, you'll hear future speakers today talk about the wide array of symptoms within addiction. The definition that we think is really helpful and useful, and something that came out of David Korn and Howard Schaefer's study, was risking something of value on the outcome of an event when the probability of winning is less than certain. Really clarifies for folks that this is how this is different from other ways that you might be spending money or time. And it's specific. I like this one specifically because of the something of value. It's important to be aware of, especially in illegal gambling, that a lot of kids especially will be gambling on things other than money, that they'll be using sneakers or electronics or other things, and not just kids, but certainly that's where we hear mostly about it. And when the event, the probability of winning is less than certain, that's another key piece. I often explain to anyone who's heard me train, I talk about the difference between shopping and gambling, and that you're certain when you hand the money over, you should be certain that you're going to get what you paid for. That's not the case with gambling. And so having people really think about that, because people will say all the time, I don't gamble. I just scratch a ticket every once in a while, or I just enter a raffle. But thinking about what that actually means, how they're spending their money, or there's something of value. Problem gambling, this is a very wide definition, but one that I think serves us well, is the term used to cover the entire range of harmful gambling involvement. That is gambling that results in some kind of negative impact on the person's life or on the lives of the gambler's family, friends, and or coworkers. It can be an occasional impact or an ongoing and serious situation. When you hear a little bit more about this today, this will make a little more sense because it really can show up. It can develop in all different ways for different people, and it's really dependent on that individual. And that's something that's really key for us to remember when we're talking to people on our helpline, that this can manifest itself in very different ways. The DSM-IV definition of pathological gambling is persistent and recurrent maladaptive gambling behavior that disrupts personal, family, or vocational pursuits. Similar definition, but not as wide. So again, we talk about it in a very general way. This is a chart that we developed from the Korn and Schaefer article, and something that we find very, very helpful to explain a number of things. I should have brought a pointer. But the level 0 is no gambling. So we know that the vast majority of people in Massachusetts, but certainly in the United States, will gamble at some point in their lifetime, and that could be all forms of gambling. So that's why that is really small, excuse me, and what they considered level 0. Level 1 is the vast majority of people in the United States, which is gambling with no adverse consequences, that they gamble at some point in their life, but they are not having any problems. Oh, there's laser pointer, thank you. Can you see it? Level 2 is gambling with some adverse consequences. So this is, I will tell you what those 10 diagnostic criteria are, but this is 4 or less. So subclinical gambling, which would also be considered, some people would call that problem gambling. Some people use problem gambling to describe the whole spectrum, and some people talk about problem gambling as the 4 or less. But that's that level 2. So this is similar to someone who says they're having some trouble with drinking, but may not be a full-blown, having a full-blown addiction with their alcohol. So this is similar there. Level 3, and you can see the level 2 is larger than level 3. Level 3 is much, much smaller. That's people who are experiencing a problem with gambling and are having severe consequences. They're having 5 or more of those diagnostic criteria. So again, much smaller, but you can see level 2 and level 3 are still smaller than level 1. Most people are experiencing a problem with level 1. And level 4, someone may talk about this today, but level 4 are the amount of people who actually enter into treatment. I think one of the hardest things about this addiction, you'll hear called the invisible addiction, the hidden addiction. It's very difficult to diagnose. And even when it's diagnosed, sometimes people still don't want to have the proper intervention. They may not be ready yet. They may not be interested. They may have another thought. The level 4 is people who are in treatment. We stress to the people who who are clinicians or training to be clinicians, that they have a really special task because so few people enter into treatment. The folks who get in to treatment and hopefully stay in treatment are typically the ones that are having the hardest time figuring out how to solve this problem that they're experiencing. What do they do with themselves? So level 4 is just that. So this just gives you a better sense of kind of how this all works out. The other thing that I really like about this is that you can go, you certainly can get worse, but you certainly also can get better. And you'll also hear a little bit about that today. Some high-risk categories that I think it's important for folks to think about. And there's certainly, a lot more we could say about these categories. But high-risk categories: child of a compulsive gambler or child of a person with another addiction. The fact that you've seen that, been around that, certainly there's a potential genetic component, and others will talk about that today. Belief that skill is involved. And that is certainly another piece that you'll hear over and over again about whether it's a game of chance or a game of skill and whether that impacts someone's ability to play it. An early big win. For my nearly 11 years at the council, I'd say that that's the #1 thing I hear on the helpline, is that an early big win is a huge factor for folks. It didn't take much time, effort, or money for me to win, so I think I can do it again. I think I have that special touch. Something is special about what I'm holding, something is special about what I'm doing, something special about what I know. So that early big win is really kind of infectious for that person. Feeling that one must chase gambling loss with more gambling. Chasing is a really huge piece of this addiction, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Early age of onset: 8.5 years for pathological gamblers and 11.5 years for non-pathological gamblers. It's a little surprising even though that 11 is old. Yeah. So folks who are not going to end up with gambling disorders start gambling around 11, and about 8 or 9 for pathological gamblers. And typically, similar to other addictions, that's typically gambling with a family member. A large first bet, and otherwise addicted or with a mental health disorder is definitely a huge risk factor for folks. Characteristics of low-risk gambling: for fun or recreation, never for financial gain. Knowledge that over time nearly everyone loses. Socially with family and friends and not alone. A limited time, frequency and duration, with predetermined limits for loss. And acknowledging that knowing a lot does not make you a better gambler. These are the DSM-4 criteria. I will tell you that the DSM-5 is it's been scheduled to come out for a very long time. So when it's going to come out, I don't know, one of these ladies may be able to give you a better sense than I. But it's, and if they know that, they're great. Just $1 million question. 2013, is that what you said, Rachel? That's the latest, 2013. It's been years in the making, so. And so some of these will be debated in that, but they're pretty good and pretty indicative. Again, being a non-clinician, talking with folks on the helpline and the work that I do, I can tell you that they're pretty indicative of folks with gambling problems. Preoccupation with gambling: a lot of these are similar to drugs and alcohol. Preoccupied with gambling: needs to gamble with increasing amounts of money to achieve desired excitement. This is tolerance. So, it used to take $50 for the game to be exciting. Now it takes $500. Repeated unsuccessful efforts to control gambling. That's very difficult to stop. You've done everything in your power. You've asked people around you to help you stop, and you just can't stop. Restless or irritable when trying to cut down or stop. Again, you'll hear more about this today, but this is something that is often surprising for folks, given this is a behavioral addiction, looking at the physiological responses that folks have when they're trying to cut down. After losing, often returns another day to get even. This is the chasing. Again, that I once, I thought that today would be the last day that I gambled, and then I have to go back because I just know that I'm hot, or I'm due, or I'm, whatever the thinking is, that I need to go back and get that money back because I'm ready. Lying to conceal extensive involvement with gambling. I'll tell you, most people who call us that are spouses think that it's an affair that's happening. They can't account for the money, and they can't account for the time, and they just assume that there's another person in their spouse's life. But indeed, it's a lot of lying related to the gambling. Has committed illegal acts to finance gambling. Again, surprising. I often say I never thought I'd know so many disbarred lawyers, but I've met a lot of them, at least on the helpline. Has jeopardized or lost significant relationship, job, educational, or career opportunity due to gambling? Hear this all the time. Last person in the world who trusted that person, gave them a home, gave them a clothes on their back, gave them some pocket change, and they still jeopardize that relationship because it was overwhelming, the power that gambling had over them. And relies on others to provide money to relieve a desperate financial situation caused by gambling. Both the chasing and this bailout, which is really kind of what you would call that, are pretty unique to gambling as opposed to other addictions. And that is it for me. So I am now going to turn it over to Scott, who's going to talk to you a little bit about his own experience.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Seeley. I'm a compulsive gambler. I live out in Western Mass, and I've been away from a bet now for about 50 months, just over 4 years. I've been very fortunate. I also am an alcoholic in recovery for just about 30 years, so I'm familiar with addiction. And when it was mentioned whether this is a behavioral, I'm nervous, excuse me, or an addiction, I can tell you one thing. I dabbled in some drugs when I was young and experienced, cocaine addiction for perhaps 6 months, which probably helped me get into recovery from my alcohol problem. And when I hit a slot machine for $4,500, it was very similar, the rush. So, anyways, like I said, I entered recovery for alcohol and drugs when I was 23 years old, and probably 2 years into that, I went down to Atlantic City. It had just opened, probably 4 years before that. Maybe it was going for a little longer than that, but I had been there previous to that while I was still in my active addiction. But when I got clean and sober, I went down and spent, a day and a night and left the next day and realized that, I had a problem gambling and that I don't belong in casinos. So, I chased it all night long. And I felt bad about it, and I realized, I should stay away from it. That's as far as I addressed it. And years later, I had a problem with scratch tickets. I was probably 10 or 15 years clean, and got into a period of, planning my trip down to town, which store I was going to stop in. I was going to hit a big one, and I came out of it and said, I can't do this, so I just stopped scratching tickets. And then the casinos south of us opened 15 years ago, and I'd occasionally make a trip down there and play some blackjack, and usually lose, and or stay until I lost whatever I had brought with me, probably $200-300. So, at that point, problem gambling, compulsive gambler, I knew enough to, not dip into the credit cards, or I still, was skirting the edge of my addiction. But in 2005, or actually in '99, I was diagnosed with a medical condition, and went through a period of, acceptance and dealing with it. And then in 2004, I had some other issues going on, and, I wasn't really taking care of myself like I should be. I was busy with life. I wasn't attending many recovery meetings, and, I became depressed. And I was still, once in a while down at the casino. And I never liked to play the slot machines because there wasn't much excitement. But one particular day I was playing a machine and I hit it for $4,500. And that started a year of just, my compulsive downfall. It was just self-destructive behavior, whatever you want to call it. But it was a ride that I hope and pray that I never have to take again. You know, over the years of being at the casino, I could, you know, some nights I'd be there late and try to get a room and couldn't get a room. I tell you, after I hit that slot machine for $4,500, I had whatever room I wanted. You know, now I was a high roller and, you know, continued to play the high limit slots. You know, I had a casino host approach me in the middle of the night. I was playing a high limit slot machine and offered me a room and, you know, any concert tickets just to make me comfortable. You know, within a month's time, I hit probably 10 machines for a total of perhaps $50,000. So, you know, I also have another business. I'm in construction in Western Mass. I'm a concrete contractor, and you know, in '07 was my my best year in business, and you know, I ended up just losing it all. You know, in a year's time, just recently, I found out what my total handle was. You know, from right around March of '06 to April or May of '07 when I bottomed out. You know, I got a daily playlist from this casino. What I put in, what I won, what I gave back was $1.5 million. And my income level at that time was probably $35,000 to $36,000. So the casino knew that I was way in over my head. And nobody ever intervened, nobody approached me, nobody said, you know, why don't you cool it, Scott? All I had to do was pick up the phone and talk to my host, and, you know, voila, I had a suite, I had whatever. You know, they continued to, you know, make me comfortable. And, you know, I ended up, you know, going down that road where enough wasn't enough. I'd go down on a Thursday night, stay till a Monday or Tuesday, lose. I had a line of credit. I would drain that, you know, use that to the extent. And then the wheels would start, you know, on the way back home. What am I going to sell? How can I get the money to pay my line of credit so I can start it all over again? It's just a vicious cycle. And, you know, I couldn't see it. As was mentioned, that it was, you know, very secretive. You know, I wasn't drunk falling down the street. I wasn't driving erratically. You know, anytime I talked to anybody about my gambling, it was, well, I just won $9,000. You know, I was, you know, ecstatic, and they didn't see the other side of it when I was in, you know, in depression and, you know, trying to figure out where my next bet was going to come from. And it was just a, you know, a quick slide to the bottom. You know, I was incapable of addressing it at the time. I was seeing a psychiatrist at UMass Medical Center for my medical condition. I was on antidepressants, and it didn't matter. I just couldn't wait. I'd be sitting in, you know, sharing with a psychiatrist and looking out the window so I could jump on 395 and head south. You know, it was just all-consuming. You know, my business started to fall apart. Then the economy fell apart. You know, I went through, you know, my life savings, my retirement. I cashed it in. I ended up with a second mortgage for $100,000. I ended up selling an antique car, motorcycle, camper, you know, anything in possession. And my next step was to commit an illegal act, you know, and that's perhaps where, you know, I bottomed out. You know, it was just uncontrollable. I had no power over it, and you know, I just couldn't be honest. I couldn't face the fact that, you know, I was in an addiction again. It was like that gorilla was back on my back, and you know, I'd go to the casino credit, and the last weekend I was there, I had a line of credit of $3,000, but they let me draw it out to $4,500. You know, I was just, you know, a con, you know, I was a liar, cheat, and thief all over again. You know, like I said, I had experienced recovery in another addiction, but I couldn't see it for myself. Till I hopefully reached that bottom and, you know, and was able to reach out and say help. You know, when it all came tumbling down, I ended up, you know, really depressed and reaching out for help. You know, 4.5 years ago, 4 years ago, I live in Western Mass, and I needed a counselor. I needed 911 right away because I ended up in my backyard with a pistol to my head. And the only reason I didn't blow my brains out was because I had 2 dogs, you know, and I live alone. You know, they saved my life. You know, I reached that despair, and but there wasn't anybody available close by. Closest trained counselor at the time was in Amherst, and he was 6 weeks out for an appointment, and I needed the emergency room. Hopefully, you know, you people have a large job in front of you, and hopefully, you know, you can work with a mass council and provide, you know, intervention, you know, prevention, intervention, and treatment, you know, because it's definitely needed. You know, I'm a miracle to be standing here today because I was this close. You know, and finally I attended some Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and through that I was introduced to the Mass Council. And I reached out there and got connected with a counselor finally, and I developed a relationship with these people at the Mass Council, and they've been fantastic. Just a really great group of people that, you know, that are full of knowledge and compassion, and just really are on board to help in any way they can. And so when I was asked to come here today, you know, I was honored to come and hopefully put across to you folks that you know, there is a definite need for you know, some real serious help in this issue. And you know, I just really want to thank you for letting me share with you today, and you know, I think that's enough out of me, and I'll let Jody share next. So thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm going to sit if that's okay. Can y'all hear me? All right. 7 years ago, I had it all. Turning 50, big party at a rented house on an island in the Thousand Islands, friends and family. I had what I used to call the big 3. I loved what I did. I had the best job in the world. I loved where I lived, in an affluent suburb outside of Boston. And I had a family who I loved and who loved me. 4 years later, I was in prison, sentenced to 2 years on 3 counts of larceny. So you wonder, what happened? I spent 30 years, closer, I spent 30 years getting to that point 7 years ago, building the life, building a family, finding the perfect job. And in 4 years, I tore it down. 7 years ago, I was in 13 years of recovery from alcoholism. Cool, you know, I'd quit. My father before me had quit. I was doing the right thing. I wasn't going to meetings, but I didn't drink. I didn't know, like I know now, that, what do they say? Your addiction will be in the parking lot doing push-ups, just waiting for you to walk out so it can clobber you. Something about turning 50, call it midlife crisis, call it whatever, call it fate. Boy, I walked out in that parking lot and that addiction took hold of me and throttled me. I went to a conference. We use dates a lot. I guess we use dates a lot. We tell stories a lot. In '05, and it was a conference at a hotel in Reno. There was a casino in there, and I was so excited. I was like, wow, a casino. And I had gambled here and there, nothing more, nothing compulsive. Now I'm like the poster child for the DSM criteria, every single one of them. But in '05, I had only gambled a handful of times. And I can't believe Scott said this amount, but I walked away from that conference with $4,500. Maybe it's the tipping point, I don't know. But that's very strange. And I thought, wow, you know, and I had meetings to go to, so I didn't gamble all the time. I would gamble and I would leave for a meeting, and that's the only reason I walked out with any money in my pocket. And then I turned 50, and then something happened. Just something happened. I started gambling, I would say compulsively, in '06. And in 12 months, I had lost almost $500,000. I had gone through everything. You know, there could be 20 of us, and you'll hear many similarities. All my savings, maxed out every credit card, taken every bit of money I could from my partner, blah, 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 home equity line, everything. But I had the gift, I had the desperation that addicts get. Irrational, insane, crazy, absolutely crazy desire to win back all I had lost. Now, I had lost over $500,000. Really, how was I going to win that back when the largest prize on the slot machine I was playing was $100,000? Anyway, remember that rational thinking has nothing to do with an addiction, compulsive gambling, especially, I think. So I began to steal from my employer. Me, nice girl from the suburbs, affluent suburbs in New Jersey, who had a great job, who had everything, like I said. And I began to steal. And I gambled, and I gambled. For just really about a year and a half. And in '07, I was caught, I was fired. And that was the end of my 30-year career. By now, I've lost, well, let me put it this way. I like this metaphor, and those who were at Amherst, forgive me for repeating myself. There's a movie, Up in the Air, with George Clooney. And he's at this motivational speaking thing, and he talks about his backpack and what we put in our backpack. So before I started gambling, I had all the things I thought I wanted. You know, a good career, loving family, things, a good car, and I always wanted more is better. I kept putting all this stuff in my backpack. Well, you know, that backpack was really heavy. So I think it just had to come off. And when I was fired, it came off. And I had to deal with this incredible threat of incarceration. And after waiting for 9 months, which was just interminable, because the justice system takes a long time to make up their mind, I went to jail. And again, I was 53 years old, sleeping on a top bunk. And it was just sort of amazing. How did I get there? Well, slot machines, that was my thing. Slot machines was my thing. I don't know why, I don't know what it was, and I would sit in front of that slot machine like a robot, not eating, not drinking, not caring, throwing away everything I had in my life to feed in $100 bills. Talk about the progressiveness that they talk about. It started at 5, 25 cents, a dollar, 5, you know, wasn't enough, more. Rush, give me the rush. $100 bills was as high as I could go, so that's where I was. And I would feed in these $100 bills like they were pennies. Pennies, $200, pull, $200, pull, $200, pull. Lost $60,000 in a weekend. And that was a good weekend. My mom once said, when this all came out, she said, how could you do that? I said, Mom, it really has nothing to do with money. Think of them as pennies, really. Think of the $100 bills as pennies. It has nothing to do with money. It's the thrill, it's the rush. You know, gambling was how I got high, and money was the drug, okay? So think of that. You know, the money is what you're putting into your system, and the high is what you get, for me, for pulling that slot machine. No one tried to stop me. God forbid they should. I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't do anything. I did this all in isolation. I wasn't like everybody else. I just wanted to do my thing. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. Mostly I lost. And I would get credit lines, sweets, you know. They treat you like you're a big shot. And one of the symptoms when we go to 12-step meetings is that compulsive gamblers especially, we like to be treated like a big shot. We sort of think we are. Our ego is in control at that point, big time. I mean, how else can you explain this irrational behavior? So they come up to you and they bring me to a room and they're like, oh my God, I would never have stayed in a suite like that in my life. They bring you anything you want, feeding that ego. As long as you keep feeding the dollar bills, or in my case, the $100 bills into the slot machines, they're going to feed your ego. And that worked well for me until it came crashing down. And I waited, I just didn't understand. I didn't understand. And I remember once talking to my host, and she knew I was a compulsive gambler. And we were talking about it. I said, well, maybe next weekend I'll come back with some more money. And she said, honey, there's not enough money in the world. She didn't say for me. But what she was saying was, for a compulsive gambler, there is not enough money in the world to satisfy the craving. You can't do it. It's bottomless. You will keep going, you will keep going, you will keep going until something stops you. There'll be people who are more academic than me talk about addiction here, but addiction is a fatal illness because it will kill you in one way or another, whether it be drugs or alcohol or gambling. Gambling, I could have had a heart attack from the stress. Of the 20 questions they asked you in GA, I answered 19 out of 20. The only one I didn't answer was, did you ever think of committing suicide? Because I'm an optimist, and I always think something's going to get better. That's why I was such a good gambler. Sure, it's going to be the next spin, I'm going to win my money back. The next spin, sure, it's going to be great. That was the only time in my life my optimism failed me. But I realized that I was really sick and that obviously quitting drinking was not enough. So I went into recovery in 2008, also when Scott did. Very weird. We both just recently celebrated our 4-year anniversaries for that. And I found a room full of losers who were really winners. These were other people who had lied, stolen, cheated, betrayed everybody they loved, every employer, well, not always by stealing or being caught, but betraying everybody they loved to scratch tickets or play poker or pull a slot machine. And these were my kind of people. I was like, wow, they get me in a way that no one else who has not experienced this addiction can ever get you. You can't experience it. No one can understand it, again, because it's irrational. So I was lucky enough to find GA. And since then, I worked on it. And I was in recovery for a year, and then I was sentenced to prison in 2009. And I spent almost 2 years there, about a little over a year and a half, 20 months, 602 days. But, I wasn't counting. And I was very lucky, I think, because I came in with recovery. I came in with a good attitude. I'm like, well, I may be doing time, but I'm not going to waste time, I read Gulliver's Travels, for God's sakes, really. And I went to every class I could, and every spiritual class, every educational class. I learned a lot about people. I learned mostly a lot about myself. And I came out a much healthier person. So in that backpack that I have now, it's not stuff, and it's not secrets, and it's not stealing or lying. In that backpack now is mental health, a desire to be as honest as I can each day of my life, a passion for going into this field. I just am just about, Thursday's my last class, to complete my certificate in substance abuse counseling at UMass Boston. I would like to get into the treatment of compulsive gamblers. There's not much out there right now, and I'm pretty old to be starting a new career, but I'm optimistic, so I shall go forward. I am healthier and happier with nothing. I lost my house, I lost my marriage, lost my career, lost my freedom, all that for nothing, for some comped suites, for a few TVs or whatever you can get with the points from the casinos. The gambling, the casinos spin a dream. And compulsive gamblers are the first ones to believe in that dream because we live in this dream world. How else, again, can you explain it? That we do what we do. If we're in touch with reality, we're not. So, I found the Mass Council. I've been out only about 15 months. I'm working very hard to get my life back together. It's not easy. I'm still on probation. But each day, one day at a time, I face what I have to do today. I have a child whom I love more than anything. I practice honesty. I work hard. I've never worked harder in my life. Never. And these are the things that have been laid before me. And this is the path I travel. And if I can pass on what I've learned to others in any form, whether they be compulsive gamblers or folks like you, then I will do that at the drop of the hat. And when Kathy and Marlene asked me to speak here, oh yeah. I'll do that. I'll tell my story. And, you know, they say that your altitude is determined by your attitude. And I love that expression. And in the old days, I guess I had a pretty bad attitude because my altitude was like crash, burn, whatever. And now, you know, I'm on the upward flight. And I have a good attitude about the future. I'm very blessed, despite the burdens I still carry, despite having to struggle with this addiction and other addictions every day, because I'm moving forward. And that's the best I can do. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Scott and Jody. You know, you can read a lot about this issue, but it's not the same as hearing people talk about what has happened in their life, and I'm really grateful to them for doing that. Thank you. Yes, sure. Sure. We're going to do we have planned to do questions at the end of when Rachel and Debbie also have spoken, but if you want to, and they're going to be here at that point too. But if you prefer to do it now, we can do that too.
I might want to do it now.
Want to do it now?
Fine.
Yeah, feel free.
Might as well.
Let's go ahead. You folks mind pausing a moment while we do questions? Okay, great.
First of all, thank you. You know, that's obviously incredibly powerful and just a part of an important process for us to learn about how to do this job. But one of the things that's implicit in the stories that you tell is the complicity of the casino operators in manipulating your disease. And I wonder, it sounds pretty clear that you believe that you were identified as a compulsive gambler and manipulated to maximize the amount of money that came from you. A, am I reading that right? And B, have you been involved in, and others can talk to this about this as well, but it's just personally about you, you would have a better way of helping people like us, regulators, figure out, you know, how you regulate, because you know all the games, you know all the tricks, you've been there, done that, and I just wonder whether you have been involved in that process of helping people like us figure out how you manage that first problem, if I understood that first problem correctly.
I'd like to address that. I had a situation with cashing checks. You know, I was trying to keep the game going, and a few times I wrote checks, and I figured I could get back home and deposit money in the account, and the check would beat me. So I bounced, I think, 2 or 3 checks down in Connecticut. And within a week or so, they would allow me to cash another check. Towards the end of my gambling, I was out in New York State at the casino that's on the Thruway, and I went to cash a check in for $600 or something, and the casino cage said, "No, you can't." And I said, "Why?" You know, and they said, "Well, you need to go over." I believe it was the Gaming Commission. The New York State Gaming Commission has an office right there, and they brought up, "No, you've bounced a check in the casino. You're never allowed to cash a check in this casino again," whether that's New York State law or that casino's policy. But it's a very good policy. It just put the brakes right on. It was like getting slapped in the face. It just stopped my addiction right in its tracks, you know. And I left, you know, and it was the end of the end. You know, it was starting, beginning of the end for me. But there needs to be safeguards in place, whether it's credit cards use. I ended up with over, I think it was $58,000 in credit card debt. Probably a lot more because I paid it off and then ran it back up again. But it was $1,000. You know, I go back to the cage, another $1,000. You know, it was just in a 24-hour period. I think I was allowed to run up to, with my line of credit, you know, $2,000 in credit card debt. But you know, there needs to be safeguards in place through the whole, you know, whether it's checks or credit cards because, you know, it's just out of control and nobody ever said, you know, until I went to New York, and it was a very good safeguard. Yeah, and you know, on top of that, with a line of credit that I had at the casino, you know, as I had mentioned, I think that year my income level was around 35,000, and they extended me a line of credit. And they knew what my play was because I used the player's card. I had a host come up to me that first introduced himself to me. He was in charge of implementing the software that tracked every player. He was on top of it. He was a nice guy, very friendly, but he knew where I was at all times. He knew my level of play, and they knew my income level. You know, that I was way above, you know, what I should have been playing. You know, $1.5 million in a year. That's not what I lost. I probably lost $300,000 to $400,000. I'm not sure. I never sat down and added it up, but my total play, you know, from what one experience, I won $11,000 at the blackjack table, and I walked into the high limit slots, and within an hour it was gone. You know, there was no, what are you doing, Scott? You know, there was no safeguards, but there needs to be safeguards in place.
I have never, no one ever tried to stop me. In fact, you know, like I said, I think I was playing some machine, and this woman walked up and introduced herself as an employee. She was a host, and asked if I wanted to spend the night, and gave me this incredible room. And that's really all. That's really all I needed. It fed. It's what you said. They manipulate. It's a strong word, but I think probably it fits. Because, you know, there's no clocks in casinos. Someone told me, I don't know if it's a myth, that they pump in oxygen so that you stay awake, because I really could I never fell asleep in front of a slot machine. I didn't realize, I didn't eat, I didn't drink, I didn't take advantage of all that. Well, I didn't drink anyway, like alcohol, but I didn't take advantage of all these things that you can get for free when you're such a high roller. I just want to sit in front of that machine. And I would stay awake all night, and when the machine broke, I would wait 2 hours for that guy to come and fix it, because I wasn't leaving that machine, because all my money was in that machine, and I knew that the next spin I was going to get that money back. No, not so much. I did once go to a conference when I was in the thick of this in '06 in Kansas City, Missouri, and man, was I mad, because talk about safeguards. If you lose $500 in 2 hours, you can't play. I lost $500 in like 20 minutes. I'm like, really? Really? I went to another casino, signed up for that one, played, went to there like 4 or 5 of them. I was just going, and then I was like, well, this is just not worth it. So I chose something healthier to do. But that I thought was crazy. But most people, I'll generalize here, don't lose $500 in 2 hours and then feel gypped that they can't lose more. So that's the only experience I had with control. But it certainly would help me, because I'm I respect authority kind of person, sort of follow the rules, except when I didn't. And if someone had said, nope, you had your limit and you really should go home, I would have been like, okay, I'm a good girl, and off I would have went. So I think that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Any other commissioners have a question at this point? Or do you want to hold them for later? Want to hold them? Okay. How about if originally we were going to have some moving happening here, but I don't think it needs to, because we had one presenter who wasn't able to show up. You need to go? All right. Marlene has a son with a broken foot yesterday, so she's got issues she's got to deal with. So, if you two folks move over, and Deb and Rachel, come on up. And I forgot to introduce Rachel and Deb before, so let me do that right now. Rachel is president of Gemini Research, a research organization that has done much work through this years on problem gambling. And Debbie LaPlante is director of research and academic affairs at the Division on Addiction, and assistant professor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So if you two would like to, if Rachel, you're going to start, I think, and then Debbie?
I guess that's what I saw on the program.
Okay, that's it.
So the reason for my little outfit here is that my daughter left this morning, or we thought she was going to leave this morning for China, but she texted me and she's still at the Hartford airport waiting for the flight out. But I forced her to listen to this talk several times because I wanted to get my timings right. So she knows exactly what I'm going to say, and I hope that you all find it as informative as she did not. Good morning, or good afternoon, actually, Chairman Crosby and all of the commissioners, and thank you for asking me to speak this afternoon. I want to focus on 3 areas in my remarks, and I should preface this by saying that you are now moving into the academic section of the program. The personal stories are very, very important, though, and maybe if you can sort of keep those in mind to balance the sort of more dry academic stuff that I'm going to be presenting. So I want to just provide some definitions for some terms that are commonly used by epidemiologists. I want to present some results from a recent study that Rob Williams and I completed on problem gambling prevalence studies. And then I actually want to present some new information that has just come out of 2 of the international studies with which I am involved. So first, some definitions. Epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health and illness in populations. It's the cornerstone method of public health research and practice, and helps inform policy decisions by identifying risk factors for disease and targets for prevention. The 2 most important concepts in epidemiology are prevalence, which refers to the number of people in a population with a disorder at one point in time, and incidence, which refers to the number of people who develop a problem over a given period of time. Enter? No, that's enter. Problem gambling prevalence in the general population is generally estimated between 1% and 5% of the adult population in jurisdictions with mature gambling markets. However, prevalence rates among adults who gamble, and even more amongst adults who gamble regularly, are far higher. In fact, problem gambling prevalence rates as high as 25%, that is 1 out of 4 players who are regular heavy gamblers on a particular activity, have been identified among slot machine players and racetrack bettors. Early population surveys have identified, or did identify, a number of characteristics that were consistently correlated with problem gambling. I'm just going to go through the mostly sociological ones of male gender, age under 30, low income, single marital status, low occupational status, and less formal education, and also non-Caucasian ethnicity were additional factors in a number of studies, as was residence in large cities. More recently, in jurisdictions where electronic gaming machines, also sometimes known as slot machines, and a lot of other terminology, in jurisdictions where they have become widespread, problem gamblers are just as likely to be female as male, a phenomenon that the Australian Productivity Commission referred to as the feminization of problem gambling. There are also some groups in the population with interesting bimodal gambling patterns. In comparison to other groups, they contain large numbers of people who gamble very little, but a proportion who gamble heavily and experience gambling-related problems at much higher rates. These groups appear to be sectors of the population in the early stages of introduction to high-risk forms of gambling. For many years, it was widely assumed that as gambling opportunities increased, there would be corresponding increases in the prevalence of problem gambling. The idea of a close link between the availability of gambling and the prevalence of problem gambling is an example of what's known as the total consumption model that has been found to apply in several areas of public health, including alcohol and tobacco consumption, obesity, high blood pressure, low birth weight. The basic assertions of this theory are that there is a close connection between average consumption of a product and the prevalence of excessive users, that consumption is distributed in the population in a bell curve, basically, characterized primarily by moderate consumption, but with a minority of excessive behavior in the far tail, and that the curve actually responds as a single entity to changes in overall distribution. So with alcohol, for example, if you can reduce the population consumption of alcohol, you actually are able to reduce the prevalence of alcohol misuse, abuse, and dependence. The nature of the link between gambling availability and problem gambling prevalence has been challenged in recent years, although investigation of this relationship has been hampered by some variability in the aspects of exposure that are selected for investigation, and also by difficulties in measuring the parameters of that exposure. Nevertheless, as you'll be hearing from Debbie, since she's one of the authors cited here, researchers have proposed a modified formulation that includes both exposure and adaptation, with the impacts of exposure confined to the early stages of the introduction of new gambling forms, while adaptation occurs subsequently at individual, community, and population levels. Along with Rob Williams and Reese Stevens, I recently completed an analysis of adult problem gambling prevalence rates to determine whether there was evidence that prevalence rates decline as populations adapt to gambling. To answer this question, we had to find ways to control for the many methodological differences among problem gambling prevalence surveys that have been carried out in different jurisdictions and in different times. We developed a number of weights, the application of which was intended to reduce the noise around the obtained prevalence rates and allow us to compare apples with apples between jurisdictions and over time within jurisdictions. So this is just some information on the study. Typical of Rob, we found everything and reviewed it. So we identified and collected a total of 202 surveys conducted internationally between 1975 and 2012 and extracted pertinent information from each study. We then examined the impact of the main methodological elements that influence problem gambling prevalence rates obtained in these studies. This included the assessment instrument used, and there are a variety of different assessment instruments that are used, whether problem gambling was assessed as a lifetime or a past year disorder, whether the survey was described as a gambling survey or something else to prospective participants, whether the survey was administered face-to-face or in some other way, whether the problem gambling questions were asked of everybody who had gambled, those who had gambled in the past year, or some other threshold. We also created weights for differences in telephone response rates, which have declined rapidly in recent years. Within each of these elements, we identified the methodological approach that produced the most valid prevalence rate and developed weights that could be applied to produce rates that would have been obtained if the valid approach had been used. And finally, we applied these weights to create standardized problem gambling prevalence rates for all of the studies. And here's the results of our work. The results of this exercise suggest strongly that problem gambling prevalence rates started rising in North America, that's the red and the blue lines, and Australia, the green line, beginning in the late 1980s to the early 1990s, and achieved a peak 10 years later in the late 1990s to early 2000s. This time interval is roughly coincident with the most rapid introduction and expansion of electronic gaming machines and casinos in these countries, the greatest increase in per capita gambling expenditure, and a significant increase in overall gambling participation. However, there has been a worldwide downward trend in both gambling and problem gambling rates beginning in the late 1990s for North America and the early 2000s for Australia and other nations. And as you can see, current rates are now very similar and in some cases below what they were in the late 1980s prior to, or more often shortly after, the start of gambling expansion. Considering that gambling availability has increased steadily in most of these jurisdictions over the last 30 years, these results provide support both for the contention that increased gambling availability is related to increased problem gambling and the contention that populations tend to adapt over time. While problem gambling prevalence generally increases in the wake of the introduction of new gambling forms, decreases in prevalence can occur for several reasons. And a variety of factors are likely to lead to a decrease in problem gambling prevalence, including recovery and professional intervention at the individual level, adjustment to the novelty of gambling opportunities or increasing awareness of potential harms at the community level, and finally, natural selection at the population level, which means that individuals are removed from the problem gambling pool due to severe personal or financial crises, criminal charges arising from their behavior, or in extreme cases, suicide. These different aspects of adaptation suggest quite different policy approaches, with prevention and early intervention more likely to be beneficial where adaptation is taking place at the individual and community levels, but stronger measures related to limiting or reducing gambling density and concentration more likely to be helpful in cases where population adaptation is occurring. Until quite recently, the vast majority of research on problem gambling was based on cross-sectional studies. And like snapshots, these studies yielded information on correlations, statistical relationships between problem gambling status, demographics, gambling participation, other physical and mental disorders at a single point in time. If repeated, these studies also yielded information on whether problem gambling prevalence had gone up or down over a given period of time. In contrast, longitudinal studies are more like movies, where the same individuals are followed and reassessed at regular intervals over extended periods of time. They allow us to examine the characteristics of people who are contributing to increases or decreases in problem gambling prevalence, and to identify factors that predict the development of gambling problems as well as successful recovery. Longitudinal studies are particularly important in helping us identify risk and protective factors associated with changes in problem gambling status so that we can develop more effective interventions and more effective policies. So this is all by way of setting up the fact that I'm involved in a number of longitudinal studies that are currently being conducted internationally. And all of these studies started with very large samples of randomly selected participants, between 6,000 and 15,000 individuals at baseline. And we are looking both at individual and group trajectories into and out of gambling. And fortunately for me, there's substantial overlap in the content of the questionnaires in the studies that I'm involved with, which actually is going to let us make some cross-cultural comparisons in the future. But in the current context, I'd like to focus on the fact that these studies were designed to allow us for the first time to measure incidence, which, if you remember at the beginning of my talk, is the number of new cases that arise over a given period of time. And it's something that hasn't been looked at before in the problem gambling research field. It's possible to do this because in each of these studies, nearly all of the participants in the baseline survey who agreed to be recontacted were followed up 1 year later. So think about 15,000 people, and 10,000 of them said, okay, you can come back to me in a year, and we went and found about 9,000 of them for the Swedish study. In Sweden, the prevalence rate of problem gambling was unchanged between the wave 1 in 2008 and wave 2 in 2009. However, 75% of the problem gamblers in wave 1 were replaced with new problem gamblers in wave 2. And of those new problem gamblers, 20% of them, 1 in 5, were considered relapsing because they had a previous history of problem gambling, a lifetime history, whereas 80% were new cases with no previous history of problem gambling. In contrast, in Victoria, Australia, 2/3 of the new problem gamblers in that study were considered relapsing, while 1/3 were new cases with no previous history of problem gambling. This next slide, and I sort of had a little fun with this slide. I realized I might be getting kind of boring by now. This next slide is from the Victoria Wave 2 report and shows shifts in gambling and problem gambling status between wave 1, which is on the right-hand side, and wave 2, which is the status at the top. This table shows that just under 6% of the wave 2 participants increased their risk status in the 12 months between the two surveys. At the same time, a little over 4% of the wave 2 participants decreased their gambling status, or their risk status, excuse me. The problem gambling group and the non-problem gambling groups were the most stable groups, but there was a lot of movement in the non-gambling group, for example, and in the two low-risk and moderate-risk groups. The considerable churn identified in both of these studies, both the Swedish and the Victoria studies, suggests that a far larger percentage of the adult population actually experiences gambling-related problems than the small proportion that score as problem or pathological gamblers at a single point in time. The consequences of these gambling-related problems, including financial difficulties and family, relationships, school, and work issues, can reverberate, as you've heard, long after the acute problem phase is resolved. So now for some sort of final stuff. Across the Swedish and Victoria studies, a number of risk factors assessed at wave 1, so at time 1, were associated with the development or recurrence of gambling problems at wave 2. The strongest of these were gambling in the past year on electronic gaming machines and casino table games, as well as on the internet, or gambling weekly on horse or dog races. Other risk factors associated with the development of gambling problems at wave 2 in both studies included poor physical or mental health, use of tobacco, and risky drinking habits at wave 1. And finally, we identified a number of additional risk factors for the development or recurrence of gambling problems across the two studies, including difficulties at work, changes in work conditions, the loss of a close relative, and changes both good and bad in personal and household finances. And I think that's it. That's it. I hope my presentation has helped you kind of understand some of the complexities of what actually is contained in that one number called the prevalence rate. And, you know, I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
So Chair Crosby and members of the Commission, thank you for the invitation to be here today as you examine this very important and complex matter. I'm going to organize my time today to answer two primary questions. First question is, how can gambling become an addiction? The second is, what is the public health impact of expanded gambling? To answer the first question, how can gambling become an addiction, requires an understanding of the nature of addiction. Historically, people have argued that things like alcohol and drugs cause addiction and that people consequently suffer from specific yet different types of addiction, alcohol addiction being distinct and different from tobacco addiction or gambling addiction, for example. Today, researchers and treatment providers mostly hold a different perspective. Rather than many different types of addiction, experts suggest that addiction is a singular process that can be expressed in many different ways. Consistent with this understanding, the American Psychiatric Association is considering a major revision of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that would provide a universal addiction-related diagnostic process rather than separate object-specific diagnostic processes as is the current procedure. This means that gambling-related disorder would be grouped with other expressions of addiction within a newly created categorization called addiction and related disorders. The addiction syndrome model that my colleagues and I from the Harvard Medical School developed is the most contemporary model of addiction that's consistent with this idea. The addiction syndrome model suggests that people express their addictive disorder depending on people's risks, exposures, and experiences. But what is the evidence that addiction is a singular disorder? What's prompted this rethinking of addiction? Evidence from a variety of scientific disciplines supports the notion that different expressions of addiction have more in common with each other than previously thought. The commonalities across expressions of addiction outweigh the differences and suggest the existence of a syndrome, which in brief is a collection of signs and symptoms that reflect an underlying disorder. From neurobiology, we know that people have an area of the brain that's involved in processing information related to reward. Scientists have referred to this area as the reward center. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies show that anticipation of things like drugs can activate our reward center. And interestingly, non-drug experiences also can activate our reward center. One study by researchers from Mass General, for example, found that beauty and money can also activate the reward center. Other evidence in support of the idea that addiction is a syndrome includes patterns of comorbidity with other mental health problems and with other expressions of addiction. People with one expression of addiction are more likely than others to also deal with other expressions of addiction and with other mental health problems. There are also many observations of treatment non-specificity, that is, evidence of a single treatment successfully addressing many different expressions of addiction. For example, topiramate for both alcohol and gambling, or cognitive behavioral therapy for basically all expressions of addiction. And finally, addiction hopping, or addiction substitution. When people stop engaging in one type of addictive behavior, they're at increased risk for adopting a new and different expression of addiction. Think of overeating as a replacement for stopping smoking or increasing smoking after quitting alcohol. Taken together, these instances of shared phenomena, as well as others I haven't mentioned, suggest that our early understanding of addiction needed revision. The objects to which an individual became addicted are part of the picture, but the development and experience of addiction is much more than those objects. In this series of slides, you'll see an illustration of the addiction syndrome model. Different individuals face the world with different sets of vulnerabilities and resiliencies. And in their life, individuals also are exposed to different potential objects of addiction. Individuals who have little vulnerability, like the person on the right there, are unlikely to develop addiction, as are people who have no exposure. However, individuals who have much vulnerability are at risk for developing addictive behavior. The type of behavior depends on what people are exposed to. For example, alcohol or gambling, and the response that they have to it. If the object generates a desirable subjective shift in experience, a high, it's a candidate for addiction. Ultimately, when addiction develops, people develop a number of shared experiences like tolerance and withdrawal, as well as object-specific experiences like bankruptcies or lung cancer, depending on whether one gambles or smokes. So, any object to which an individual is exposed and with which they interact holds the potential to become an object of addiction if the person has sufficient risk and the object provides a reliable, desirable subjective shift in experience. And this leads to the second question that I'd like to discuss today. If exposure is a key component to the development of addiction, then what is the public health impact of expanded gambling? Many studies have suggested a relationship between increases in gambling opportunities and increases in gambling and gambling-related problems. For instance, the National Gambling Impact Study Commission reported early on that having a casino within 50 miles of one home elevates that person's risk for developing a gambling-related problem. Similarly, our work at the Division on Addiction illustrates the association between the presence of gambling opportunities and self-exclusion rates in Missouri. You can see the small dots are the areas where there are gambling opportunities. More intense color, red color, indicates more use of the self-exclusion program. The same thing here you see in Iowa. Again, you can see that areas of intense help seeking through their helpline calls, as well as the locations of the various gambling opportunities. However, more recent research, some of which Rachel shared, reveals that these and similar studies only tell part of the story. In fact, exposure effects like these vary depending on a number of different things. So exposure effects depend on location. Adding a casino in Las Vegas is going to impact the community differently than adding a casino where gambling opportunities are limited. Exposure effects depend on populations. Some communities are more vulnerable than others, and therefore the presence of a casino is likely to affect those communities differently than more resilient communities. Exposure effects depend on timing, and during the rest of my time today, I'm going to discuss how short-term effects of the presence of gambling opportunities are different from the long-term effects. So what you see in this slide is a prototypical exposure and adaptation curve drawn from public health. Typically, it's used to illustrate population-level effects of biological and environmental toxins like viruses or lead paint. The division has found that this curve also can be applied to potential social toxins like gambling. In brief, this curve suggests that the immediate consequences of new exposures results in increases in problems, like disease. However, in most cases, that initial increase reaches a peak, indicating that most of the vulnerable already have succumbed, and the rest of the population is more resilient. After this peak, people and society adapt, and the original problem tends to return to earlier levels. Although most studies concerning gambling exposure are not longitudinal, some are forthcoming, a few studies can provide some insight into how exposure impacts populations over time. For instance, an examination of the self-exclusion rates in Missouri over time indicate that those rates have changed from the early period of the program to the later in a way that's consistent with public health exposure and adaptation modeling. And similarly, one longitudinal study conducted in Canada showed that gambling-related problems did not escalate linearly following the addition of a new casino in the region. Rather, rates of problems increased in the short run, but later returned to pre-casino levels. And finally, in some of our own work at the division involving internet gambling, we observed among more than 40,000 people that new subscribers to an internet gambling service also followed a similar pattern. Initial increases in activity following new exposure and later evidences of adaptation. Taken together, these findings and others that I've not had time to mention suggest that exposure effects are not as straightforward as many people assume. Instead, exposure effects vary depending on many different characteristics. Most specifically, exposure seems to be of limited duration. This pattern suggests that different processes will be needed to deal with gambling-related problems over time. For example, it might be that in the short term, more widespread, intensive intervention and prevention is necessary. But in the longer term, people who have problems might be more difficult to locate, and their problems might be more entrenched. So intervention and prevention efforts might need to be more targeted and precise. The exact approach that Massachusetts will need to take is not yet clear, and effective contemporary research methods that allow for ongoing and efficient monitoring of gambling and gambling-related problems should guide the process. Later today, my colleague Dr. Sarah Nelson is going to talk about the importance of empirical evaluation and evidence-based intervention. For now, I'd like to thank you again for your time and the opportunity to speak today. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, as I'm sure are the other panelists. And for those who won't have the opportunity to ask questions, this final slide lists a number of Division on Addiction resources related to addiction. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Debbie, very much for that. We do have some time for questions. If the commissioners would like to ask some questions at this point. Go ahead, Commissioner Crosby.
Thank you. Thank you both for Rachel and Debbie for that. It's really interesting stuff. Like Jody, I'm an optimist, so I grabbed onto that chart that both of you described, where clearly the introduction of casino gambling, by all the evidence, is going to have a substantial increase. Because of the increased exposure, there's going to be a substantially increased prevalence. But there seems to be that standard decline that you showed for many kinds of public health problems, and that you showed. Do we know pretty well how to maximize the decline in that curve, and is it just a matter of doing it, or do we not really yet know what the variables are that cause that decline?
I'm not sure, can you hear me? Okay. We don't know very much about what specifically causes, adaptation and decline. Although it's very encouraging to see that it is there. It would be nice to be able to minimize the increase that you see at the beginning from the very beginning. And I've speculated with colleagues that if you had prevention and particularly primary prevention, public education, and sort of media campaigns or social marketing is what they call it, at least in New Zealand, where they're engaged in a major social marketing campaigns. The idea is that you inoculate people ahead of the availability of the new form of gambling. And so the idea there is that essentially you start your prevention program before the casinos become operational, so then people are, at least to some extent, inoculated and are informed about, what might be risky behaviors going into the casino, and hopefully that would be a way to minimize the harm.
I would just build on that, I guess, by saying that one of the primary reasons that we don't know a whole lot about the adaptation processes is that this work is so very new, and the amount of longitudinal studies that's available in the field is extremely limited, in part because they're so financially prohibitive. I think that this, might provide an overly optimistic perspective. And I would just be cautious. Some people might think that, interpret this, both of our presentations, to say, well, all you have to do is just wait, and then things will be fine. They'll go back to the way they were. But I think that, like Rachel said, that it's important to address kind of the beginning end of that process, and to push that along. Unfortunately, we don't know how long that process is going to be. The internet gambling slide that I showed, suggested that adaptation process started, after 7 days. The Missouri slide that I showed was over years. So it might be that, we need to do a little bit more legwork here in Massachusetts to figure out exactly what's going to be happening over time. Every market is different.
I guess I would just add to that in addition to every market being different, many of the activities are quite different and appeal to different groups in the population. So, for example, the feminization of problem gambling that I referred to early on in my remarks that the Australian Productivity Commission was so concerned about, that actually arose because electronic gaming machines, or these very sophisticated slot machines, were legalized in a number of jurisdictions, states in Australia, and they were legalized in a very sort of open door way, so that essentially people who were going to social clubs or social clubs and sports clubs were allowed to have as many slot machines as they wanted in their venues. And what happened was social clubs in Australia are places where families go and people go to socialize, and suddenly there were all these very sophisticated slot machines, and they saw some very significant impacts, and particularly in terms of women feeling comfortable in those venues and then starting to gamble on machines and then get in trouble with them.
A related question, from this anecdotal stories that Jody and Scott told, it sounds like the degree of commitment of the casino operators to trying to identify compulsive gamblers and control them vary tremendously. In some cases it sounds like essentially they were targeting you and encouraging you, but in other places you went, Kansas and New York, it sounded like they were really committed to trying to identify people and help you manage it. asking all of you, is that well known? I mean, do we know pretty well what the tactics are that the casinos can operate to minimize the abuse of gambling and the incidence of problem gambling, or is that not known either? Are we missing the will, or are we missing the knowledge to manage at the site?
I think that there's a small amount that's known, but there's far more that tends to sort of be, oh, well, that's something that they did in, you know, in Missouri, or they did it in Iowa, so we're going to do it in Missouri. And very similar to sort of how legalization happens, you know, one jurisdiction and then the neighboring jurisdiction and then the neighboring jurisdiction, you know, feels that they need to introduce that form of gambling. Policies like self-exclusion programs really have taken on a life of their own, in spite of the fact that there have only been 15 academic studies that have been done of the effectiveness of self-exclusion. So there's all these jurisdictions now that have self-exclusion policies, but there's, compared to the number of jurisdictions that have adopted it, the number of jurisdictions that have evaluated it is tiny.
I would just add to that that one of the issues that we're facing as far as identifying people who have problems actually on the casino floor is that we have a hard time doing that even as researchers and as treatment providers. There are hundreds of different screens, you know, for pathological and problem gambling. DSM itself, you know, has held one standard. Now it's changing its standard. It's moving it from impulse control disorders over to an addiction and related disorders. So, you know, if you're asking people, you know, who do this kind of full time, you know, as researchers, epidemiologists, treatment providers to do it, even they might not agree. So when you're asking someone who, you know, is on the casino floor and they're servicing slot machines or they're providing cocktails to be able to do the job of those professionals, when the professionals can't even agree, I think it's a very difficult task.
Point on the other end, when I got out of the casino scene and got into recovery, one of the problems that arose was a tax issue with the Department of Revenue. I owed almost $20,000 in income tax because out of state they wouldn't take the Massachusetts tax. And whenever I hit a slot machine for $1,200 or more, I got a W-2, you know, and I just, well, yeah, I'll pay it off, I'll pay it off. And when I bottomed out, you know, that was faced, you know, to me. And so I was making payments, $400 and $500 a month. And I had a particular collector that was just ruthless. He wanted me to sign an agreement for $1,000 a month. I was in bankruptcy, my business was kaput, I was struggling to pay my mortgage, and he was just relentless. So I would go into the Pittsfield office to make a payment so I wouldn't miss the date, you know, because if I put it in the mail and it was late, he was going to take my driver's license and blah, blah, blah. So I got talking to a collector at the Pittsfield Department of Revenue office, which you could probably get a lot of information on. And they said 40 to 45% of our cases are problem gamblers that we're trying to collect money from. That's huge. You know, that's huge. I don't know how accurate it was, but that's what I was told, you know. So go to the Department of Revenue and ask them. I've since cleared that up.
I haven't. That's one of the many monkeys on my back. But you said, is there will or knowledge? I'm not an academic. I'd say it's a lack of will. There's knowledge out there. It may not be as you know, as much officially, which is what I know most people have to respect. But I was an easy spot. You know, I was just easy. You just don't do what I did. And you just don't have a person show up out of the blue and say, hey, would you like to spend the night? And here's this beautiful suite. I'm like, huh? Okay. It's will. They want you there. They want to feed my ego. They want to feed our egos. They want us to lose money. I mean, it's a profit business. And us 1 to 5%, I think that's what you said, 1 to 5%, lucky us, feed an awful lot of that money into the casino. So unscientifically speaking, I'd say it's will.
I wanted to follow up on this discussion a little bit by asking what the, picking up really on what Jody just said, what is the problem that we're trying to deal with? Are we trying to deal with the identification of, or the correlation between gambling and addictive behavior, or the way addictive behavior manifests itself? Or is, if we have a singularity of addictive behaviors, as was suggested perhaps in the forthcoming new DSM, are we really looking for ways to check addictive behavior in different environments? The most effective way to check addictive behavior in different environments. It seems to me depending on how to identify the problem, the strategies for combating it may be slightly different. They may be dramatically different. So I wonder what the essence of the issue is, particularly for regulators, for academics and for those who are trying to treat people. There may be a whole variety of different things, but for regulators, what is the main problem we should be looking at, or the main issue we should be looking at?
I'll let Debbie go first.
Thanks. I guess I would say that you can't ignore either. I think that you have to be looking for cues related to addiction and cues that are specific to gambling. The way that we understand addiction is that there are processes that are similar across a variety of different expressions of addiction. And there are going to be markers that are going to be associated with those processes. But there are also going to be markers that are going to be more specific to gambling and gambling behavior. I think that ignoring either side of that equation is going to, hold the potential of, misidentifying people in both directions. Either as having problems, when a problem doesn't exist, or not having a problem when one actually exists.
And I guess I would say from the point of view of the regulators, there's a variety of tools that are available to you. More probably than I realize, because I'm not a regulator. I think that the challenge that we face in terms of problem gambling is that we've had relatively little research done or investigation of what works in different environments. It's sort of conventional wisdom. It's widely accepted that internet gambling is not only more pervasive than many other forms of gambling, but it also has the possibility for being able to be more efficiently regulated in terms of, if you're monitoring everybody's behavior at every single step of the way, your opportunities to intervene are that much greater. Whereas if, you're sort of looking at casino operators who are just dealing with, massive numbers of people coming and going, maybe they've got most of them on a loyalty program. There is a potential here in Massachusetts to be able to monitor the customer tracking data to see if there are measures that could be put in place, as simple as sort of, Jody gets sent an email or even a letter saying, we noticed that you've been at the casino X number of times in the last 3 months, and here's a coupon to go shopping instead of coming to the casino. Or to do something that you enjoy, that they know you enjoy because you signed up for the loyalty program and they know some of your preferences. In the Netherlands, the casinos are all owned and operated by the Dutch government. But they have a very interesting program in place where because people have to show their identity card when they come in and it's scanned, so the Dutch government, if you're a Dutch citizen, it knows exactly how many times you've visited any of the 8 casinos that it operates. And if you visit a casino more than 8 times in a given period of time, I think it's a, you know, like a 3-month period or whatever they've set, they actually have a program in place where someone will approach you when you sign in and say, come have a cup of coffee. We'd like to talk to you about the fact that you've been to the casino too many times in this period of time, and we'd like you to cool off.
I think at the same time this afternoon you'll hear a little bit more about the need for kind of evidence-based regulation and policy making. And you know, I think that people are, you know, have the best intentions, and everyone is trying to kind of minimize the harmful impacts of gambling. But you know, some of the things that people come up with do need to be evaluated. There is the potential for unintended consequences. For example, if you say that there is a certain amount that people are allowed to spend within a specific time, or if they're allowed to visit a certain number of times, people might think that that's a safe amount. And maybe they would only decide normally on their own to come once a month, but they say, well, I could go up to 8 times. And then maybe I'm going to go 8 times instead, because I know if I go 8, I'll be fine. If I go 9, I'm in trouble. So I think that there needs to be kind of some evaluation following some of these kind of well-intentioned proposals as well, just to make sure that we aren't incidentally provoking behaviors that we're trying to prevent.
And I would absolutely endorse that. That you know, you need evidence of what's working as well as evidence of what's not working in order to you know, sort of make decisions about what's good policy. So to the effect that, or to the extent that you know, as policies are, or as regulations are considered, you know, is there an evidence base for that regulation or for that requirement on the licensee? I think it would be valuable to sort of look at the evidence base that exists for a given policy before you sort of, you know, oh, well, you know, they did it in Missouri, and they did it in Iowa, and they did it in Indiana, and they're doing it all over the world, therefore it must work. I wouldn't make that assumption.
Can I ask a quick question about timing? We're into our break time a little bit. Do you want to keep asking questions and extend a little bit later in the day, or shorten break time, or both? Or?
We've been pretty flexible on schedule since it's our TV show and it's our conference. So I think if commissioners have this is important enough that we'll run over if we need to.
Fine, sounds good.
I had a question relative to something you mentioned, Rachel, which is this notion of inoculation prior to, it's almost like a vaccine, I guess, prior to a casino coming operational. Could you talk a little bit more about that, or I'll invite the panel, of course. Also in the context of substitution that you've also talked about at other times, substituting perhaps an addiction on alcohol or let's say scratch tickets now with casinos coming in. Anything you want to mention relative to what tools or processes or procedures maybe you've seen elsewhere relative to this moment that we're in right now, which is just about to proceed with this?
I guess in terms of the inoculation issue, it seems like a sensible idea, and I certainly agree that, you know, the idea that you sort of, you know, vaccinate people ahead of time. I mean, we gave my daughter a typhoid vaccine before she went off to China, not because we thought she might need it, but because the tropical medicine guy said, well, you know, she's in China, so she has to have typhoid. I'm like, okay. So, you know, it may not be that she ever is exposed to typhoid, but at least now we know she's protected. I was sort of more thinking about an approach that's been taken in New Zealand, where back in the early 1990s, they had very high rates of problem gambling, and they now have some of the lowest rates of problem gambling in the world. But part of that has been driven by an enormous amount of community engagement, by a very significant investment in a public health approach to minimizing harm. And from a regulatory perspective, they actually have implemented what's called a sinking lid approach, where they passed a new law in New Zealand in 2005, I believe, that mandated a huge number of measures by these social clubs, because they also had them in New Zealand, in terms of, you know, they had to have food and beverage, and it couldn't just be like a little microwave and a coffee machine, you know, next to the 5 slot machines. They were trying to basically drive all of the marginal operators out of the market. And the data suggests quite clearly that that is in fact what they did. They also, however, put an enormous investment into conducting this social marketing campaign, which was basically about, you know, New Zealanders gamble in a healthy way. And it was directed at different communities in New Zealand. New Zealand is a very diverse country. They have an indigenous population. They have about 20% of their population is mainland Chinese who come over to learn English. So they have, but they have this sort of very comprehensive plan, and they have they publish a strategic plan every 3 years for what they're going to do for prevention, for treatment, and for research on the issue of problem gambling. So I think to the extent that we can sort of think about this as, you know, as a planning process going forward, and learning from what's been done, that would be all to the good. I'm not quite as confident about the question you asked about the substitution of addictions. I actually think there's some other people at the table that might be better able to answer that. I've done all of my work has been in gambling, and I've certainly seen, you know, people who switch from, you know, sports betting to betting on poker when it becomes, you know, a faddish thing to do, or when they think that they, you know, have skills that they can transfer. But I wasn't quite sure if that's what you were asking about.
Can you repeat that part of the question again?
Well, I was more trying to frame it in the context of maybe there is a population, a high-risk population out there, because we already know that they're addicted, or they have been addicted to you know, any number of things that could be targeted for this notion of inoculation. I guess that's, you know, I was thinking rather than a, you know, public whole approach, shotgun approach. Maybe that's a wrong word, but rather than the targeting is what I'm kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That there are different populations, different communities that are going to have more risk factors, more vulnerabilities, and you know, it might make sense to kind of have a different or a specialized approach in those communities. Now, to my knowledge, I don't know that anyone has ever evaluated anything like that, you know, prior to, you know, the opening of new gaming opportunities. So whether, you know, speaking from a scientific perspective, I couldn't say whether or not, you know, that would be beneficial or not. But I think that it certainly makes sense. You know, the addiction is kind of a recursive kind of problem. You know, each additional symptom that you gain, you know, with your primary addiction sets you up, you know, for additional risk for developing new problems, new mental health problems, and new other expressions of addiction. So it's kind of this vicious circle. And, you know, historically, people really have focused on the symptoms rather than treating the problem as a whole. And I think that, you know, anyone who's experienced a cold kind of can understand why that wouldn't work. You know, if you take some cough medicine, it might suppress your cough for a while, but that doesn't mean that you're healed or that you're recovered. Your immune system is still battling, and you know, you're still at risk for, you know, developing other new infections. It's the same, a similar kind of process here, but at a social level.
I just had a comment about this, actually. Interesting and not surprising, I guess, to hear about, you know, what we all just asked about, which was the one addiction, having maybe an addictive personality, having, you know, you're more at risk for this addiction. I had an issue in New Jersey with some oversight from an enforcement standpoint. At one point, we had over 200 troopers enforcing and regulating in the casinos in Atlantic City, and one of the things that I noticed was a higher level of risky behavior with those individuals. I mean, I was on the phone with EAP lots of times, moving troopers out of Atlantic City because of alcohol, prostitution, kind of getting involved with living the life that they worked in that environment every day. So I really saw it from that standpoint, being careful, protecting people, getting them the help that they needed, and that was just being around they weren't allowed to gamble, by the way, they were banned, but the other behaviors seem to be more prevalent.
It reminds me of some work that we've done with casino employees, and we've actually found that casino employees themselves are at risk for a lot of those similar, you know, risk behaviors, alcohol, drug use, smoking, and even gambling-related problems. So that's definitely another population that, you know, needs some careful attention.
Are you familiar with slot machines on U.S. bases in other countries? The council did a forum at a veteran center, and that was brought up, you know, that they provide, you know, because high risk, you know, the high intensity of soldiers, and it's a way to release, you know, very susceptible.
Just not many people know that the Department of Defense operates a network of 19,000 slot machines located at overseas bases. That's a big operator.
Anyone else on the commission? Yes, I think Commissioner Stebbins.
I want to go back to address the inoculation. And we talked about this issue before. Council had out a bunch of Massachusetts in terms of building capacity among the providers of treatment services. Is there, you know, is caseworkers, social workers at the whole professional level is dealing with people with addictive personalities and other addictions? On other addictions, is there a way to interject this kind of diagnosis or begin to assess somebody's ability to kind of fall into a gambling addiction before it's, you know, and have a follow-up trip?
Well, you're all looking at me.
I have an answer too.
Well, I don't have an answer. I have some comments.
Okay.
The way that the Massachusetts Council has worked in trying to do that is we work through the Department of Public Health, through the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services, and supposedly all of the substance abuse agencies have been trained or have had the opportunity for training to be able to identify and to recognize problem gamblers in their caseload, and then to be able to refer to the few gambling treatment programs that there are if they're not feeling qualified to treat themselves. One of the things that would have been a simple intervention that we hadn't been able to get through up to this point, and I'm an optimist too, and I think it's going to happen someday, and maybe the commission will have some influence on this, but simply that would be screening in all the substance abuse agencies is such a simple, basic step, and it hasn't materialized yet.
The other piece that we've looked at is we work with the substance abuse agencies through the Department of Public Health. There's a number of different state agencies. There's Department of Social Services, there's Department of Transitional Assistance, there's Department of Social Services, where these issues all intersect. And again, we've talked with Executive Office of Health and Human Services a number of times about integrating those services into all of those agencies where they see people who are vulnerable populations. I think those are all real basic first steps that haven't really happened yet. But Rachel?
I think the only thing I would add to that is that they call problem and pathological gambling a hidden addiction. They call problem gambling a hidden addiction for a reason. It's hidden, and people don't like to talk about it. And it really is very difficult to even get professionals who are trained sometimes to ask, you know, someone who's presenting for an alcohol problem, do you think you might have a problem with your gambling as well? But that is what's needed, because you know, only about 3% of people in the general population who have a serious gambling problem, I mean, a diagnosable disorder, only about 3% of them ever actually access specialized services. And so you've got, you know, 97% of them who are accessing healthcare providers for other reasons, but who are not being asked the question and may not want to answer the question that, you know, is some part of this problem related to your gambling? And if you could do that at a minimum, you know, sort of build that into the healthcare system in Massachusetts, I think it would be a game changer.
I brought that point up to my physician, and he said there is a, you know, especially in the elderly population, there's a big need for, you know, some attention. You know, he sees it, but does it get addressed? No, but there's, you know, great opportunity to, you know, to present that, you know, integrate it.
And that it hasn't happened, I think, is not because there's any ill will any place. I mean, I think people all realize it, but it's that whole system people talk about all the time with everybody's in their own silos, funding goes through certain silos. It's just, structurally, it's a monster that's hard to get to work together.
I just want to say that I think, and again, I'm not an academic, I don't know the statistics, I'm sort of living this disease versus studying it. And I think compulsive gambling is where alcohol was 30, 40 years ago. You know, my dad, when he didn't drink, he quit drinking in the 60s, and he was a banker, and he went to all the parties, you know, like Mad Men. They had all those parties where everybody drank. And he told me later, he would just say, oh, do you want to drink? No, no, why not? Doesn't agree with me. He could never talk about it. Nowadays, people could say, I don't drink. And either you don't want to, or they assume you're a recovering alcoholic, and good for you sometimes will come out. This is at that stage now. You know, people, generalizing, don't realize it's a problem. You know, sure, you give scratch tickets in your kid's stocking. You give scratch tickets out at parties, you know, oh, who's going to win? It's innocuous in the small term, but it's a part of the, you know, a public awareness. And, you know, I think personally what needs to happen is a public awareness campaign that this is not a joke, that gambling is not a joke. It's a choice, and we're not going to try to take it away from you, you guys. But, you know, isn't it all about balance? You know, one of the things in my backpack is balance. And boy, it's pretty nice when I can have it. And it's a balance, and you guys, poor guys, are, you know, given the task of trying to achieve that balance between, you know, public awareness, which is going to take a lot of time. Look how long it took for people to put on their seatbelts, you know? Years that campaign has gone on. So, you know, again, it's probably a mixture of a lot of that.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. And should we take a break on that note and come back maybe at, how about 25 after 3? Does that work?